Hi, everybody. How are you all doing? I hope well. All right, so I'm just gonna jump into the content. We are week 10, and this week I'm gonna be focusing on site specificity. Okay, so we're gonna talk about the environment in regards to art and site specific work, in particular land art or earth art. It's often called earthworks or land art. This week's topic is one of my favorites just because my background is very deeply rooted in environmental work, in landscape, in architecture. And so as you'll see in this week's lecture and this week's content and reading, all about land art and environmental stuff. So what I'm going to be doing for today's lecture is actually kind of going through some slides that are going to reference or introduce you to this week's reading, which is by Rosalind Krauss. You see her here. And the title of this writing is Sculpture in the Expanded Field. And as you can see, it was written in 1979. So always good to be kind of tracking our historic readings. So we're working our way into the 80s. We're getting a little closer to current day. And the reason why I'm assigning the Rosalind Krauss's reading this week is that Krauss is actually in the art world become a very influential theorist and critic, and through her writing. She does a lot of critical writing. This is in October magazine, and her work, not only the one you're going to read this week, but many of her works have had a real influence and kind of an influence on the art world based on how she has decided to use her words and her definitions to define a movement. Okay, and so the power of language is related to what Krauss is going to be doing in this week's reading. So let me share my screen, and then I'm just going to jump into kind of giving an introduction to this reading, so that as you're going through it this week, it is potentially a little dense, and so hopefully this introduction will help kind of clarify what we're working with here. Okay, so when you're going through the reading this week, there's some images of artists and artwork, but there's also a pretty important graph in the reading, and that's what's on the screen here. And the reason for this is, as I was saying, Krauss, as a theorist and a critic, often uses her writing to help define the art movement that she's seeing at the time. So this was 1979, right? And yeah, 1979. And during the 60s and 70s, we're moving into that postmodern time. And land art in particular is a section of this postmodern world that doesn't have a lot of definition. So we have this term sculpture, which you see at the bottom here. And Rosalind Krauss is going to argue in this article the term sculpture just isn't cutting it anymore in order to define all the different types of sculpture or land art or site work or earthworks that's starting to happen. And as we know, also, it's postmodern. So a lot of artists within the land art movement are moving outside of the gallery. They're leaving the gallery walls. They're leaving the museums. They're going out to the expanded field, as Rosalind Krauss defines it, and they're making stuff, right? And so she wants to kind of give it more meaning, more clarity, more definition than just sculpture. So we're going to come back to referencing this this chart here, this graph that she's made, because she does a lot of categorizations, right? A lot of categories for things. But first, I just want to show some of the images of the sculpture that she is going to be referencing at the beginning of the article. So the beginning of the article, she's going to be talking about this modern to postmodern. She's going to use examples of what is a sculpture. So coming back here, sculpture right here at the bottom of the page. Rosalind Krauss argues that sculpture, which is from the modern era, is basically any artwork that is autonomous, can live on its own, it's sightless, basically. We're thinking always about site specificity. So this is a sculpture and it doesn't need a site. It's got a pedestal. You can pick it up and put it in one park, put it in another park. The site doesn't really carry that much weight. And that is what Krauss defines as a modern piece. And as you can see here where it says sculpture, sculpture is a combination of not landscape and not architecture. So that might feel a little abstract right now, but basically it's not landscape, it's not architecture, it's its own thing, it's autonomous, it's sightless. So that makes it sculpture through her definition. She also will reference in her reading Rodin's other piece here, The Gates of Hell in 1880. So these kind of generally autonomous objects that can move to different places, and therefore they are sculpture in her definition. Okay, whoops, so we're back at this graph here, sculpture. Then she's going to move in the article and start talking about these other 3 points of this diamond here, okay? There's the marked site, okay? There's the site construction and the axiomatic structures. Axiomatic is just a fancy word for obvious or clear, understandable structures, okay? So these are what she is really going to start talking about in the article as the postmodern movement into the expanded field, okay? We had sculpture before, we understand it as its own thing. Now in the 60s and 70s, the land art movement is moving into these 3 other areas that she's categorized. So marked sites, as we can see, she's defining as they kind of live between being a landscape, but they're also not a landscape. Okay, so we'll get into that. Things that are landscapes, but not landscapes. Site construction are things that are landscape and architecture combined. Okay, and then axiomatic structures, or you can even just think of these as structures, structure sites, are things that are architectural and not architectural. So just like Mark says, they are that thing, but they're also not that thing. So I'm gonna obviously this can feel a little confusing when we first look at it because there's a lot of opposites and opposing things. And so I want to go into some examples. And she is going to discuss examples in the reading as well. And some of them have images, but this is you know, you can always come back and look at these references to give it some clarity and see them. So let's start with site construction, okay? Site construction was up here at the top of the pyramid or the diamond. Krauss defines this in the reading as a landscape architecture combo. So some examples of that, and these are early. So this is actually one of Smithson's first pieces. It's in the reading. It's called Partially Buried Woodshed by Robert Smithson in 1970. And she's defining, if we go back to this again, she's saying that this is a landscape and architecture combined. And so when we start to look at this piece, you can see that, and that, yes, this is, by the way, like the finished piece looks like a construction site, right? So it's got that, but it's got landscape as part of it, this mounding, and it's got architecture, which is the bones of, you know, the wood here. So in Krauss's categorizations and definition, this is in that site construction, okay? Another example that she will talk about in the reading is by Mary Miss. You might remember we've actually looked at some of Mary Miss's work before, but this is early Mary Miss work. This is called Perimeter Pavilions and Decoys. I think it was in 1978 or 79 it was created, 1978. And again, right, thinking this is an example of where landscape and architecture are merging. This is one part of the work, but you can see that, of course, there's architecture merged with the landscape here. And then here's another example, Michael Heiser, City Complex here, or Complex 1 is the name of this piece. And we can look at this and kind of see that, of course, there is architectural moments, but there's also a lot of Michael Heiser's work is also, of course, moving of earth and land. And so this combination of those. So these are 3 examples of works that she discusses as falling into this site construction category of the expanded field. Now let's look at marked sites, okay? And let's come back to our thing. Remind ourselves, marked sites in her definition is sites that are landscape, but also not landscape, okay? So what she means by that, this is an example, okay? Probably we all know Spiral Jetty, also by Smithson. This is definitely a landscape, but it's not a natural landscape, right? There's no architecture here. It's all landscape-based elements. So that's why it falls into landscape. It's all landscape, but it's also kind of a natural, or it's not typical for a landscape. This was constructed by man. So that combination of landscape and not landscape is represented here. This is a piece by Christo and Jean-Claude, Running Fence. Similar, where we're seeing it's definitely a lot about the landscape. They're marking, this piece is all about kind of marking the landscape for miles and miles. I think maybe hundreds of miles. I forget the details, but they just have this running fence through an entire state and marking the landscape. But of course, it's not a typical landscape. So there's also aspects of this that are not landscape. Another example that she'll discuss is this is Michael Heiser as well, but now the Michael Heiser piece is fitting into a different category, just like Smithson. This one is a landscape that's not a landscape. So same idea, kind of a Spiral Jetty, right? Where it's not a natural site, but it is all natural in the landscape. Okay, and then the third on the chart here is the axiomatic structure. So remember, let me scroll back up really quick. Axiomatic structures are just kind of obvious structures. So things that are architecture, they feel and look and represent architecture, but then they're not architecture at the end of the day, right? So let's look at some examples of that. Here we've got a Richard Serra piece. You guys know a good amount about Richard Serra now. We talked about him with the tilted arc controversy. So this is another one of his pieces from 1970. And we can see here that's clearly, it functions as architecture because it has a retaining element, it's a retaining wall, but it's not a retaining wall. It's an art piece. So it's that architecture and not architecture. This is another Christo and Jean-Claude piece. This is in Germany, Wrapped Reichstag, their Capitol building, I believe. And if you know Christo and Jean-Claude's work, they do a lot of wrappings. And obviously, when we look at this piece, the architecture is an essential element. The building is there, but it's also being covered by these wrappings, which makes it not architecture. So those combinations here, axiomatic structure, right? And then the last example of an axiomatic structure here is by Robert Irwin. He's actually one of my favorite artists. This piece is called Dusk to Dawn. And Robert Irwin has done a whole lot of work, but some of his work deals with these kind of clear screens and scrims. And so this piece is a lot about a lot of his work is about capturing light and understanding and movement. And so this is architecture. It's obviously, it looks like walls, it's got doors, we got windows. So there's clearly architecture there, but it's also not architecture, right? Because it's a specialized art piece, a site-specific piece for this room, for this space, for this light. And so back here we are again at the graph that you guys are going to get used to seeing this week, is thinking about those again, right? So we talked early on, sculptures are autonomous, they're on a pedestal, they're kind of their own thing from the modern period. Marked sites are the landscapes that are also not landscapes because they're artworks. Site constructions are landscapes and architecture together, that merging. And axiomatic structures are the architecture that's not architecture, right? Because it's an artwork. So the reading will, of course, go into much more depth on all of this, but please feel free to come back to these slides, which are in Google Drive, and just kind of look at some of these pieces as a reminder of kind of what fits where. yeah, and the reading, I think a lot of you, I can tell this semester, you know, there's a lot of good kind of historic understanding and thought process in here. So I hope you'll enjoy it. I guess just to wrap up, I want to mention, I mentioned already, Krauss's work becomes significant because she created like a frame and a definition for these things in a time and period when those frames didn't exist. And so I think it's just another good example as artists, as creators, as producers, as many of our, how do we think about the power of language as you're reading this, you know, how does the power of language and also the understandings of structures in her role in the structures kind of have an impact in how we look back at the art of the past, but then of course, from current day, how do you all define your own work? What words, what terms, what power is there in the language of how you represent your artwork? Maybe just to keep that in the back of your head while you're reading through how Rosalind Krauss defines these expanded field of artworks in site-specific art. So yeah, in the next, you guys will see, as always, some fun artists to look at, get a little more in depth with some of the important, or there's many influential land artists. We're really only going to focus on 3 just to keep it kind of swallowable or digestible. So Nancy Hull, Agnes Denise, and Christo and Jean-Claude, you guys will kind of dig into them a little more this week in the next content. So enjoy that, and looking forward to your feedback on the reading. Okay, I'll catch y'all later. Bye.